My name is Thailand Chi. I'm originally was born and raised in China. I came to the U.S. in '83. Now I've lived longer in the U.S. than in China. Then you can calculate how old I am. And, I often go back to China just to keep my Chinese accent alive. I'm often asked to talk about China's economy and business environment because that's part of my teaching responsibilities. My research is international business. Sometimes I go to China and collect data. The topic actually was dictated by Nancy. Or I just revised my slides a little bit to add a little more content. Let me ask you a few questions about China. What kind of political system do you think China has?
One-party state.
One-party state.
Kind of like Kansas.
Well, I would say you can see some similarities, but yeah, it's very accurate and academic too. Any other adjectives you hear from the media, from the popular press, when people talk about China, referring to the Chinese?
I don't know if I've heard it in the press, but it seems to me in some ways it's becoming kind of a hybrid.
Yes, economically it's very hybrid system. But if you look at the popular press, and you talk to people in the street, people often still refer to China as a communist country. Do you think the Chinese leaders still believe in communism? Sometimes people make that comparison, yeah, and they want to maintain their power, right? But communism, if you look at the writings of Karl Marx, it's a well, I would say it's a kind of utopian state, right? And the Chinese tried that, and they failed miserably in the 50s and 60s and even 70s. They said, okay, this is not working for us. Right? If you take one of the Chinese leaders to a private room, it's asked, do you still believe in communism as defined by Karl Marx? And he probably would tell you, not really, it didn't work for us, right? we are experimenting something that works, right? And has it made any significant change, a movement toward democracy? Yes, no, yeah. Well, right. So the society opened up a lot, but in terms of political system, it's still a party state, as this gentleman stated accurately. And if you try to use the dichotomy between authoritarianism and democracy, China is still an authoritarian state. Right? The economic system, how do you describe or characterize China's economic system?
I would say the state-managed capital.
Right. So a lot of researchers would characterize China as a state capitalism. It's a hybrid, as someone else said, it's a hybrid system, right? A hybrid system. China entered the WTO as a non-market economy. The reason for the Chinese to agree to that was that there was a specification in the WTO clause that the market economy should have free trade unions. The Chinese leaders at the time did not want free trade unions. They knew what happened to Poland when the Solidarity Union formed and evolved, grew. And so they said, okay, non-market system is okay. And after they entered the WTO, they said, well, that's a problem because they actually, in many aspects, are more market-oriented than many WTO members who are characterized as a market economy. But now they face anti-dumping tariffs that are easily imposed by other countries. When China is characterized as a non-market economy, the US can, for instance, claim that this Chinese product is being sold at a price lower than cost. Well, how do you measure cost? Well, let's go to a country that has high cost, right? And compare it, because we cannot use Chinese cost because Chinese cost does not reflect market prices. That's I guess the principle we rely. But in China, China actually has highly competitive markets in many ways. Now, how do you characterize China's legal and regulatory system? Is it does China have rule of law as we know it? There seems to be some of you shaking your heads. It's still largely rule of man, and the party leaders would make decisions. And there are elections, but the candidates have been screened by the party and by the top. Because it's more of a top-down system. They elect their leaders first. So the current leaders will elect the next generation of leaders, or select, not elect, select through consultation, horse trading. So these people will take over when we retire. And then these people will decide who will be the next level, lower level, right? And then they have, I guess, elections. But the elections, the candidates have been screened. Sometimes there are multiple candidates. One of them may win over the other, but the party says it's okay. Any of them will be fine. I compiled economic growth data of all these countries for the fastest growing 10 years, fastest growing 20 years, and fastest growing 30 years, right? For the 10-year periods, some of the countries actually grew faster. Some of the economies grew faster than China. Singapore, for instance, Korea. And China is about a little over 10% for the fastest 10-year growing periods. And for 20-year periods, some other countries are close. China was, on the surface, is fastest growing. And for 30-year periods, China is indeed the fastest growing country ever on record, right? And the question is, well, what's the consequence? How did they do it, right? Based on my last calculation, the economy, our per capita GDP grew, 16 to 17 times in the 30-some years. One, I guess, a positive outcome is the increases in Human Development Index. It's an index compiled by United Nations Development Program, and includes not just per capita income, but also education level and the life expectancy. Just to put it in perspective, the U.S. per capita, HDI is about 0.915. Brazil is close to China, slightly higher. India is 0.6. The lowest one is Niger, 0.348. If you look at the trends, the long-term trend, China does seem to have the steepest growth in Human Development Index. Because as people get richer, they spend money on a lot of things. One of the things that they spent on was beer. You probably have seen this data before. People say, well, China has lifted 400 million or to 600 million people out of poverty. This data, of course, it's not so precise. Chinese poverty line is pretty low. Right? If you live above poverty line, you're pretty still very poor. But many of the 400 million or 600 million have been far above poverty. They became middle class, right? And so one specific data point relates to child malnutrition. It used to be about 30% in the 70s. And last time the UN did the survey, that was a few years ago, it was 3.3%. But child obesity now is a problem. The Chinese think the more you feed the child, the more healthy the child becomes as a grown-up. And how many of you have had Peking duck for a meal? So they feed their children like Peking duck. So it's a health risk now. Life expectancy or literacy. I'm sorry, literacy among young people is about 99%. Of course, China has become a world economic power, the second largest economy by whatever measure you use, right? Only after the U.S. However, if you measure the domestic gross domestic product based on the same prices, right? So it's a haircut in Kansas, same price as in maybe Xi'an, China, and a fast food meal. The price, the services and the products the same. They're called the PPP method. China's economy is calculated to be larger than the U.S. economy, but both methods have problems. There's a PPP measure, in a way, measures living standards. How much you consume to live. But it doesn't reflect goods that can be sold internationally. I guess doesn't entirely reflect goods that can be sold internationally, because a lot of people in China are poor or poorer. Many services are cheaper. In that case, the other people actually live better because of some citizens that don't earn much. Right? And China has been the largest exporter since 2009. But China's export is, in a way, exaggerated, overstated, so to speak, because China is the hub. Is the hub of the Asian value chain. A lot of components are imported into China from Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia. So that's these components. Some often high-end components, more expensive than Chinese products, right? And Toshiba chips, computer chips, U.S. CPU chips, U.S.-made CPU chips, flat screen from South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. So an iPhone assembled finally in China only leaves 5% of its value in China, and most of the value, of course, goes to Apple, design, and then Toshiba, Samsung, and other Taiwanese manufacturers. In that case, China imports a lot of components and exports the total value of the product, even though, in terms of iPhone, only 5% goes to China. In that kind, China imports a lot and exports a lot. The real value added is only a small layer of this large amount. Right? Of course, the International Monetary Fund just a couple of years ago designated the Chinese currency as a world reserve currency, together with the dollar, the euro, the pound, and the Japanese yen. And it doesn't really mean a lot. But it is a recognition that the Chinese economy is strong enough, large enough Chinese economy is sufficiently open to justify the use of Chinese currency as a reserve, medium reserve, and people are still gradually increasing the use of Chinese currency as a medium of payment and reserve. The question that I want to focus on is what enabled China to develop so fast. Right? And let's go to the economic theories and see what economists, the developmental and institutional economists, say is needed for an economy to grow. And then we'll see what China has in terms of the elements that the economists think are needed. And because one of them, how many of you heard about the Washington Consensus? Well, it was in the 90s, I think during the Clinton administration, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, a lot of development experts, the State Department had a meeting. So how can we foster global growth and promote democracy? It says, well, so the best way is to have two elements in any developing country. One is the market economic system, because the rationale by that time, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and other Eastern European countries, seems clear. The market transmits information faster and gives people incentive to create wealth. China started reform in the late 70s. Reform continued to expand. And so China adopted a more market-oriented system. So a lot of entrepreneurs start businesses. So that's Randy thought of this title, venture capitalism, communism. When I took students to Shanghai, Pudong area, and they said, just in this district, we have 3,000 startups in the month. So people start businesses. There wasn't much constraint to new businesses in most parts of China. The second element that was considered necessary by the Washington Consensus was a democratic political system. Right? And one element of the system is a free election. Right? Through free election, you can remove bad leaders. Right? So at least, or if assume people are rational, they analyze the policies of the candidates and they elect good leaders. Well, recent experiences have taught people some lessons, and it does not always lead to the best outcome. China does not have a democratic electorate system. The party preordains the candidates. Right? Another important element of a democratic system is free press. Through free press, you can expose corruption and curb abuse. Right? It's an important factor. Right? China still practices media censorship. Right? And you might have heard about the so-called Great Firewall of China. If you go to China, you access Google, it's problematic. And because probably a crucial element is independent judiciary. Right? The contracts signed, people renege on their contract. What do you do? Well, if there's a reliable, efficient judiciary, you can have a large recourse there, right? And can sue the cheater or abuser, and also control official abuse. Right? When government abuses power, you can sue the government. But China again does not have an independent judiciary. The courts under the control of a party. Right? And up until now, the problem is even more severe because the judges are appointed by the party officials at the same level, the province or city. They appoint the judges. Well, how can the judges prosecute the officials that appoint them? course, they are trying to find a solution that is to change the appointment of judges, not the same level, but higher level. It's like a Supreme Court would appoint next level judges, and then the appellate court would appoint the provincial court. So let's try to remove that problem. But still, there's no independent judiciary. If you go down the list, another important condition is a stable macroeconomic policies. Independent central bank. In the electoral democracy is important because the party in power would be motivated to, say, issue a lot of money before election. So people feel rich, and then they will elect the party that is in power, right? So in most industrialized countries, the central bank is independent. The Federal Reserve System, the chair person has a 7-year term, does not overlap with the electoral cycle. So, and secondly, you need effective taxation systems. Latin American countries, for a long time, had no revenues to support the government, and the only way they could do it was to print money. And then fuel inflation, and inflation would slow down growth. Right? But do you think that is important in China? China has no independent central bank. And let's think about it. Do you think independent central bank is as important to China as to a democratic system?
Well, if they're not independent, isn't there danger of setting values on money and for exchange rates?
The government officials, the high central government officials, has the power to determine the money supply. They can determine what the inflation rate will be, how much money people will have, right? So under electoral democracy, the perverse incentive comes when during election season. Right? So in China, there's no election season. Right? So think about that. Right? Another important condition, again, for economic development growth is an efficient capital market. The banks will recycle money from depositors to investors, to entrepreneurs. The stock market, that's the same function. But in China, I guess the listing of stocks is controlled by the government. Largest state banks are still state-owned. Largest banks still state-owned. And the stock market is considered like a casino. Right? But the Chinese like gambling anyways. Right? Yes.
Can you go back to the point on pervasive tax evasion?
Right.
How pervasive is that?
Well, it's improving. I think I once met a Canadian businessman doing business in China, Canadian entrepreneur. He said, well, I like doing business in China because you can take the tax collector to lunch and negotiate with tax collector. He said, the tax is too high for me. I cannot pay. If I pay your tax, I won't be in business, right? He says, well, how much can you pay? Right, let's negotiate. Through lunch, the tax collector will say, okay, so I'll give you a discount, right? so it's people pay tax. The central government actually is flush with tax money. But the physical system has a problem because the provincial and city governments don't have enough money. So they are doing a fiscal reform in the last couple of years, try to balance the budget of every level. Also, because the taxation has been improving, but you say one, because Fujimori became the president of Peru, there's a huge budget deficit, and he hired a Catholic priest to be his tax collector, and the priest actually called in the military, surrounded downtown Lima, and searched financial records of companies to get tax. because without tax, the government cannot function. Whether it's the services, so strictly speaking, the Chinese financial system is still quite underdeveloped. Right? And finally, another important condition is the coordination of the investment. And suppose you want to build automotive factory in the middle of Africa, and well, you can have assembly lines set up, but you need to manufacture the engines and the chassis, the transmission, and in addition to that, you need plastics, you need steel, right? And there's a lot of coordination needed. But it's hard to have one company doing all of these because companies or individuals have different skills and expertise, right? Coordination, well, people may have honestly different judgments. There's no place to sell a car right now. We're not going to invest. But when one of the parties doesn't invest, you have no automotive industry in that country or in that region. So the coordination is important. In the infrastructure, economists would say have externalities. People who build infrastructure have to, because either they have to charge, or if you don't charge, then you cannot recover your investment. Right? And if you build tolls everywhere, the whole system slows down too. So it's a classic dilemma. Do you charge for using infrastructure or not? Right? How do you charge it? And it needed some coordination. And whether you can recover your costs. This is high risk. Well, the government in China coordinate that really well. Right? If you go to the coastal cities, even many of the interior, you can see infrastructure just as good as many industrialized countries, or even better. It's newly built, newer technology. But next I want to see, well, how does China address these apparent deficiencies? Right? You see the deficiencies, and the crucial difference between China and many other authoritarian states is the existence of long tradition to have a well-oiled bureaucracy. The Chinese, for well over 1,000 years, probably maybe 15,000 years, 1,500 years or more, had few ways to move up social ladder, except education. The emperor was inherited, through the family, but the officials were selected among the people who could pass the exam. And then based on the advisors' opinions, the emperor would appoint them to be officials. Since the first dynasty, Qin dynasty, it's a big bureaucracy built up. There are periods of turbulence and chaos, but this tradition remained. The Communist Party set up the system again. Right? The parties and the party state, right? The party has a giant centralized HR system. It's larger than any multinational company's HR system, human resource. They call it organization department. Right? And they screen all officials for promotion, give exams, and evaluates them year after year. And those who can deliver economic growth, deliver whatever the party wants, get promoted. Right? And so give the people incentive, the officials incentive to meet the goals. And they also give officials a lot of discretion. Right? There are benefits and costs. The benefit is that you are motivated to deliver economic growth, and you are given a lot of discretion, so you do whatever that works in promoting economic growth. One Harvard Business School professor wrote a book on India and China. He referred to the two countries as countries of entrepreneurs, but he added a caveat there. So China is not just a country of private entrepreneurs. All the officials are entrepreneurs. They experiment with all kinds of methods to promote economic growth. Right? And because sometimes they use methods that are strange or sometimes ridiculous. So in one case, the a county or a city, right? City imposed quotas on all city officials who recruit investors. So the city, that main judge, was supposed to try a case, and the journalists from the national newspaper went to court to see the case, and the judge wasn't there. And finally they found the judge in the restaurant wooing an investor. And so I mean, if you believe all these I guess economic theories, if they can set up a good legal system in the city, maybe they will promote investment even in the long term better. Right? All right, so that's just but one of the downside is also corruption. I'll see they have a lot of power, and even though China practices censorship, the media are basically for-profit organizations, except a few controlled by the central government. Right? And so because what do you report to make money for media? What kind of news do you report? When you need to sell your news to make money.
Scandal, entertainment.
Exactly, sensational news, right? So corruption is one thing. So often the government and the media have a cat and mouse game. Media uncovers a scandalous case or corruption, and then the government may not want this to be reported too widely. Sometimes they want it because they realize that the
Like now, here in the U.S. Exactly as it's going on now.
but the Chinese government actually realizes that some media monitoring helps them catch bad officials. Right? And I guess a lot of this centralized HR stems from the Confucian legalist philosophies. Right? The Confucian philosophy says if you, as an emperor, want to sustain your dynasty, you need to take care of your subjects. In the long run, if you don't take care of your subjects, they'll rebel and throw you out. A new dynasty will come. So that's the basic philosophy. So for a long-term self-interest, they try to think what they can do to the governed, to the ruled, so that the ruled won't rebel. So that has a feedback system. And as I just mentioned, the banking system is actually quite effective. They controlled inflation and growth very precisely, much better than any other country probably, because there's an extremely tight and precise coordination between the fiscal policy makers and the monetary policy makers. Right? Of course, if China further opens up, they'll need an independent central bank. Right? And state-owned enterprises are still inefficient, banking inefficient. They, in a way, outsource their governance. Foreign investors will try to straighten up the Chinese companies, including banks. And a lot of Chinese companies issue stocks in the US, in Hong Kong. Why do they do that? They actually have a lot of money in China. They don't need the money. It's not for the money. It's for the governance system. The Hong Kong stock market monitoring system, the US stock market monitoring system functions better than the Chinese system. And when they have that, they can have very stable stock prices, and stock prices actually relate to performance, right? Have a closer link, and then they can give their managers options and bonuses based on stock prices. So that's an outsourcing of their governance. Because the U.S. outsources manufacturing to China, service to India, and a lot of Chinese companies outsource their governance to the U.S. But I'll quickly discuss some of the strains that have developed in the system, right? Because of rapid growth and heavy reliance on export and investment, this whole economy is skewed toward these two things, right? Export and investment. Consumption level is low. Right? It's the lowest of any country in a comparable development level. The Chinese only consume about 39% of their income. And at some point, 49% of their income is savings. And investment is as high as 50%. That's too high. How many highways or airports can you build? In China, in many ways, it's saturated. And also, when you build too many houses or highways, you buy land, you create real estate bubbles. Another side effect of the growth is growing inequality. I guess most people have seen their living standard increase substantially, but some people got extremely wealthy. And here at KU, even Johnson Community College, you may see young kids driving Mercedes, but if you go to Southern California and they drive Porsche, is low end, right? So just an extreme wealthy. And just put that in perspective, it's higher than income inequality in the US, which is considered high in developed countries, and slightly lower in Brazil, but the Chinese don't, for a lot of wealthy Chinese hide their wealth, so maybe it's as high as in Brazil. Environmental damage, I think we'll hear a lot of insights from Professor Brown about the environmental damage in Asia. China contributes a lot to that. It's not just the air that's polluted, but lack of water. And even though they are very successful in removing large particles in the air, but the small particles, they just couldn't do it. Right? And some experts say by removing the large particles in the air, you allow the little particles float. The large particles actually will bring the small particles down. But now the Chinese citizens are wealthy enough to demand change. They said, what's bothering me most? It's the air, one of the things. And corruption is rampant. I won't go into the detail, but it's comparable to the level in India or Brazil. The question is, why do you think corruption hasn't stopped growth? If corruption is so rampant, people cannot make money honestly, and why would they invest and make money? What enabled the Chinese to grow despite the corruption? Well, it's puzzling. I guess corruption isn't severe enough to make it unprofitable for entrepreneurs to make money. That's one part of it. Secondly, corruption is related to this entrepreneurial spirit of the officials. Officials are corrupt, they are enriching their pockets, but in the meantime, they are trying to do things that promote growth. It's not just sucking wealth out of the society.
Well, and businesses, especially in Brazil, it's just part of doing business. They just have to put it in their budget. The payments that they'll have to make to get bureaucratic processes taken care of.
Right. Right. In China, it's somewhat similar to Brazil because even if you pay money, you don't know if you can get it for businesses. I talked to some Chinese business people. They said, when I invested in Indonesia, so give a briefcase of dollars, you'll get what you want. But in China, you may end up in jail. So it's very treacherous. So now, to address all these problems, they are trying to reorient the economy to change the growth model. Right? One is to shift from low-cost manufacturing to higher and more knowledge-intensive manufacturing. And they are a second shift that is being pushed is shifting from industry to service, right? To employ more people, to move people from rural areas to the cities. And a third prong of the change is to shift from this bureaucratic system with high discretion to a bureaucratic system with lower discretion for the officials. More rule-based system, so it can curb corruption and also curb other ills from the growth, like environmental damage. And yes?
Question. On the second point, when you talk about people moving into the cities from the poor areas, how does that affect population in some of the cities? Because isn't there a lot of overpopulation in cities, or is that not true?
Yes. They are actually trying to build up more cities.
Okay.
Right. And in China now, I think one calculation says about 1,000 cities with more than 1 million people.
Okay.
Would you also add as a proposed solution a transitioning from export to a more consumer?
Right. That's also part of it. Right.
And how are they doing?
Actually, consumption has consistently surpassed the growth of GDP. People are consuming more of their income. Right. Randy?
What about the idea that there needs to be a cap on growth? That growth is not always the right model, is not necessarily the right model anymore.
They call it the new normal. That's a lower rate of growth. So they think that growth has costs. This environmental damage and so on and so forth. So they said, well, now we want lower growth. Actually, we're not pursuing higher. Just the last slide, for implications for U.S.-China relations. In the economic area, right, China is upgrading its manufacturing capacity, right? And China is likely to import fewer middle, higher-end components and machines. The reduction of Chinese export. That can add to U.S.-China trade tension there. And Chinese companies actually are outsourcing a lot, outsourcing to other developing countries where labor cost is lower. And there may be kind of reshoring, they call it. Reshoring into the U.S., for instance. There's textiles in North Carolina, South Carolina. And also, because the Chinese are also trying to invest in high-tech industries, companies. That's causing friction with the U.S. too. U.S. does not want companies to sell themselves to Chinese companies for security, national security concerns. And China's shift to service industries may actually open up the Chinese market more into U.S. service providers, particularly banks and IT companies, right? And that would ease the tension. In the meantime, a lot of them may try to expand their footprint outside, like including the U.S. Then Chinese investment has been causing some backlash in the U.S. and in Australia and Europe. And if you remember what happened to Japanese investment in the 80s, people started to become concerned about the Japanese buying up U.S. Assets. And I'm not talking about all the problems, but it relates to the China's shift to a new growth model. And China's created this so-called One Belt and One Road initiative. Right? The idea is to build transportation and infrastructure networks connecting China to West Eurasia. Right? And there's a land route and the sea route, right? Through ports, railways, highways. So this China, this is the sea route, this is the land route. Right? And why do they do that? Is that out of their goodness of heart? No. Yeah. Do they try to project power? Yeah, if you look at the economics, they have several. There are several factors. One is that they have been building the infrastructure like crazy in China. Now the return on infrastructure investment is down. So they have all this capacity, engineering capacity, construction capacity, equipment, so on and so forth. But they also realize is that the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank thought there was $3 trillion of deficit of infrastructure in developing countries. So they said, well, we can export all these services. Right? And they also accumulated $3 trillion of foreign exchange reserves. They have a lot of money to lend. I can lend money to other developing countries, help them build infrastructure, which will lower the transportation cost of China's export and China's import. Right? So they think this is a win-win situation. Right? And they are China also is influencing global economic institutions. China's voice or vote in the World Bank, International Monetary Fund has been increased. But for a while, that increase was stalled by the U.S. Congress. Maybe just out of spite to Obama, the Congress would not bring it up to a vote. The U.S. government agreed to an increase in Chinese votes, but couldn't make it reality. Finally, it happened last year. Right? But before it happened, the Chinese got impatient. So, wow, we started our own initiative called Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the New Development Bank. China is the largest shareholder in these international institutions. And China is now wielding more clouds in international lending, international development. Well, let me just stop here. Right.